Every morning, Victor Stanton walks out the door, believing he controls everything, his business, his mansion, his future. But on this autumn day, it's not a bodyguard or a lawyer who saves him. It's a 13-year-old housekeeper's daughter. When Amira falls to her knees and begs him not to go outside, Victor laughs until her voice shakes with a truth no child should have to carry. What she knows could cost her everything. What he chooses next will change both their lives forever. Stay with us to witness a story of betrayal, loyalty, and the invisible girl who stopped an empire from falling. Victor Stanton didn't pause as he descended the front steps of his estate that morning. His routine was as polished as his shoes, sharp, quiet, deliberate. He adjusted the knot of his red tie, checked his cufflinks, and barely glanced at the waiting car just beyond the iron gate. Everything was in motion. A critical merger meeting awaited him in Manhattan, and deals of that size didn't tolerate lateness. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket, but he didn't check it. Not yet. He was still mentally rehearsing numbers, projections, contingency language. When he reached the final step, he tightened his grip on the leather briefcase, unaware that his entire world was about to be rerouted by someone no one in that house had ever taken seriously. Her voice was the first crack in the frame. Not a call, not a question. Just a desperate plea. "Mr. Stanton, please!" His name spoken like a warning, not a title. He stopped instinctively, more out of annoyance than concern. He turned and saw her, Amira Morales, 13, the housekeeper's daughter, barely more than a shadow in his periphery until now. But here she was, standing between him and the door, trembling, eyes full of something he didn't yet recognize. Amira's face was pale, and her voice cracked mid-sentence as she stepped closer, clutching the hem of her faded red dress as though it might anchor her. "You can't go outside," she said, the words tumbling over each other. "Please, you have to listen." She said, "I heard her on the phone." Victor blinked, not out of comprehension but disbelief. This wasn't happening. He glanced toward the grand doorway, mildly aware that Carter, his head of security, was nowhere to be seen. A note he filed away, but didn't yet connect. "Amira," he said slowly, voice tight with authority, "where's your mother?" Her lips trembled. "Upstairs. I didn't mean to hear it. I was just getting towels from the linen closet and she didn't know I was there. But she said it. If you leave now, you won't come back." He narrowed his eyes. "You're saying, Claire, my wife is planning to kill me?" The words felt ridiculous, even as he said them aloud. Amira nodded violently. "She told someone on the phone, clear as day. She said it had looked like an accident, that you'd never make it to the car." Her hands began to shake. "You have to believe me." He didn't. Not entirely, not yet, but something in her eyes wouldn't let him dismiss it outright. Victor prided himself on spotting liars, clients, rivals, board members who swore loyalty while holding knives behind their backs. But this wasn't manipulation. This was terror. Not the imagined kind either, the kind that wrapped itself around a child's spine and pulled her forward into something dangerous because staying silent would be worse. "I don't have time for games," he said. But there was hesitation now, a slight lag between words. He glanced again toward the gate. His usual driver wasn't there. A different man stood by the car, one Victor didn't recognize, holding papers. Something flickered in his chest. "She's lying to you," Amira whispered, like she could read his doubt. "She doesn't love you. She only loves what you give her. She wants it all." He looked down at her then, really looked, and something shifted. She had nothing to gain, no reason to invent this, and yet she stood before him, risking everything. The image of Claire, so calm in recent weeks, came rushing back. Her cold smiles, the late-night calls behind closed doors, the sudden changes in his schedule. Victor drew in a sharp breath. For a man who built his empire on logic, trust was never freely given. But neither was fear. And what Amira was offering him now wasn't a conspiracy. It was a warning. The briefcase in his hand suddenly felt heavier, like it carried not contracts but consequences. "You shouldn't be involved in this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Amira straightened her back. "I already am. I just don't want to find out later that I could have stopped something and didn't." The certainty in her voice hit him harder than the claim itself. She wasn't just frightened, she was resolved. And that scared him more than the idea of Claire turning on him, because it meant whatever Amira had heard, it was real enough for her to throw herself between him and the front door, like a soldier on a battlefield. He looked at her again, his heartbeat finally catching up to the moment. "If you're wrong," he started, but she cut him off. "Then I'll leave. I'll never speak to you again. But if I'm right..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. A part of him still wanted to laugh it off, to push past her and call the whole thing absurd, but the instinct that had built his entire empire was now shouting at him to stop. Every warning bell in his mind, every red flag he'd ever learned to read, Amira was all of them at once. He took one step back toward the interior of the house. He pulled out his phone. "Carter!" he barked into the receiver when the call connected. "Where are you?" The hesitation on the other end was too long. I'm at the front gate, sir, but something's wrong." Victor froze. "Your driver, he's not one of ours. Said he was a replacement sent by Mrs. Stanton, and there's a black SUV parked nearby. Looks like it's waiting for something." Silence fell. Amira didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't have to. The words had landed. The truth had arrived. Victor lowered the phone slowly. His eyes returned to the girl in front of him, 13, forgotten, invisible, who had just saved his life. And for the first time in a very long time, Victor Stanton did something unfamiliar. He stood completely still, and he stayed. Victor Stanton didn't believe in omens. Superstition was for people who didn't understand control. And Victor had built his life, his empire, on one single principle. Everything is controllable if you're willing to pay the price. He had never believed in gut feelings either. They were a liability in business, a gateway to bad decisions. But now, standing just inside the entrance of his home, phone still in hand, he felt something low and cold beginning to crack through that discipline. He kept replaying Amira's voice in his head, too raw to be rehearsed, too terrified to be fake. It made no sense. Claire, his wife, arranging something so sinister it required a stranger at his gates and a child to stop him from walking to his own death. No, it didn't add up. But it didn't need to. Not yet. What needed to happen now was confirmation, not speculation. He opened his phone again, scrolled to his security contact list, and tapped Carter's name. The call rang twice before it picked up. Victor's voice came out steady, but colder than usual. "Where are you?" Carter's voice on the other end wasn't calm. "Sir, I'm at the gate. I've been trying to reach you. Something's off." Victor's throat tightened at the tone. "Explain," he demanded. "There's a guy here, not one of ours, wearing a standard uniform, holding papers signed by Mrs. Stanton. Claims he's your new driver. Says you requested a switch this morning, but that wasn't on the schedule. And there's a black SUV across the street. Been parked there for 30 minutes, hasn't moved. 2 men inside. They're not looking at the house like it's scenery. They're watching it." Carter paused, then added, "My gut says it's not random, sir." Victor's jaw clenched, hand tightening around the edge of the marble console beside him. "Do not leave your position," he ordered. "Do not let that car out of your sight. I'll call you back." He hung up and exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing the breath out like it might take the disbelief with it. Claire. She had the authority. She had the signature. And the timing. Of course, it lined up too perfectly. Suddenly, all those weeks of quiet, of her tiptoeing through the house like she was avoiding a mirror, started to resurface. He hadn't seen it then, but hindsight was cruel in its clarity. She had been laying the foundation, not for a divorce or a departure, but an erasure. The thought made Victor stagger a half step backward. Not out of fear, but out of insult. Of all the ways to end a marriage, she had chosen the one that required a body bag. And more disturbingly, she'd almost succeeded. If he had stepped outside 5 minutes earlier, if Amira had said nothing, he would have sat inside that car without question. The briefcase he still held in his hand felt suddenly laughable, filled with numbers and deals that meant nothing in comparison to what he had almost lost. Everything. He set it down on the table beside him and stared at the closed front door like it had betrayed him. It hadn't, of course. The betrayal had worn perfume and a wedding ring. But the door had been the passage, the final step toward destruction that he would have taken without blinking, until a girl in a red dress had stood in his way. That part is what burned. He'd built walls, towers, fortresses around himself. Paid security teams, vetted every employee, watched every bank transaction. But the one soul who had noticed what no one else did was a 13-year-old child he'd barely acknowledged until today. Victor rubbed his temples, suddenly aware of the migraine brewing behind his eyes. For years, he'd operated under the belief that being right was the most important thing. Now, he was learning that being blind was far more dangerous. And Amira had seen it. He thought back to how her voice had cracked, not from immaturity but from urgency. She hadn't run to him out of fear for herself. She had done it for him, without expecting thanks, without needing to be believed. The realization left a hollow ache in his chest, one he didn't know how to process. What kind of man had he become, that a girl had risked her place in his home, her safety, just to make sure he didn't die? And he'd almost laughed in her face. He sat down for a moment, not in defeat, but in re-evaluation, the kind of stillness that comes not from exhaustion, but from clarity. He wasn't sure what would come next, what confrontation awaited him upstairs with Claire, but he knew without doubt that something had cracked inside him today, something old, something arrogant. Still seated, Victor reached again for his phone, not to call Claire, not yet. Instead, he stared at the call log, the record of Carter's words echoing in his mind. Not one of ours. Signed by your wife. SUV across the street. The facts stacked themselves like evidence. But it wasn't until he glanced over to the staircase, empty now, but where Amira had disappeared just minutes earlier, that it truly hit him. No one else had warned him. No assistant, no lawyer, no security personnel, despite all the systems in place. Just her. A child who had no reason to be brave, but was. A child he hadn't seen until she stood between him and death. And the worst part, she'd expected him not to believe her. She'd begged anyway. For him, not for herself. That truth settled like a weight in his chest. For the first time in years, Victor Stanton questioned whether the people closest to him actually saw him at all, and whether he had ever truly seen them in return. Victor wasn't a man given to emotional theatrics. He didn't pace when angry or cry when overwhelmed. But now, as he stood again and picked up his phone for the second time, his hand trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that someone had saved him. Not through expertise, not through planning, through instinct, through courage, and that someone was a child who had absolutely no reason to care if he lived or died. That part didn't make sense, but it didn't have to. What mattered now wasn't explaining it. What mattered was accepting it. He looked toward the front door once more, then back toward the house behind him. He wasn't ready to face Claire yet, but he was ready for something else. Something new, perhaps even something honest. For the first time in a very long time, Victor Stanton understood that the only person telling the truth in his life might be the one he'd never bothered to look at. A child, a housekeeper's daughter, invisible until today. Claire Davenport Stanton stood at her vanity mirror with the same poise she'd maintained throughout every gala, every dinner party, every carefully constructed photo in the lifestyle magazine spreads. Her posture was flawless, one hand delicately applying a coat of nude lipstick, the other steady against the marble, as if the mirror might show her something she didn't already own. She didn't turn when Victor opened the bedroom door behind her. She didn't jump, didn't flinch. She had heard his steps before he even reached the top of the stairs. That was Claire, always knowing what came next, always preparing her performance 3 scenes ahead. But this wasn't a performance anymore. This was the final act. She met his eyes in the mirror when he entered the room, as if they were simply discussing paint swatches or charity donations. "Victor," she said with mild amusement, "you're early. The meeting didn't go as planned." He didn't answer. He just stared, jaw clenched, pulse loud in his neck. She waited for him to speak first. That too was always her strategy. Let others rush forward, reveal themselves, while she stayed centered, composed. It had always worked. Until now. He closed the door behind him quietly. The kind of quiet that meant rage wasn't necessary anymore. Truth had arrived first. Claire placed the lipstick back in its case, eyes still on his reflection. "Something wrong?" she asked, her voice smooth, maybe even playful. "You're looking at me like I poisoned your drink." That landed. He took a step closer. "Don't play with me, Claire," he said, voice low, deadly calm. "You switched my driver. You cleared Carter off the gate. You told someone I'd be alone. You left a car with 2 men, parked less than 100 feet from this house." Claire turned now, finally facing him directly. But her expression didn't shift. "You sound paranoid," she replied. "Is this because I signed off on a last-minute change?" "I thought you wanted more flexibility with your drivers," he scoffed. "Cut the act. I called Carter. He saw the car. The man wasn't ours. You knew I wouldn't question it, that I'd walk right into it. That's what you were counting on, wasn't it?" Claire walked toward the armchair by the window and sat down, crossing her legs with deliberate grace. "You're overreacting. You've been working too much. The stress, the late nights. He was waiting to kill me, Claire." Victor interrupted, each word sharpened with disgust. "You plotted to have me dead before breakfast, and you almost succeeded." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Not denial, not explanation. That was the moment Victor knew. He didn't need a confession. He had the pause, the look, the absence of denial that was louder than any scream. Her eyes flickered, not with guilt but calculation. She was already recalibrating, already weighing what this confrontation cost her and what she might still salvage. And in that split second, he saw the truth of her, fully exposed. Claire didn't fail because she hesitated. She failed because Amira didn't. Victor's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Was it for money? Were you that impatient? You could have had everything eventually." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Eventually is just another word for never, Victor. You always said you'd restructure your will, make adjustments, but they never came. You planned to die in your chair, empire intact, never letting go of a single inch of it." Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired, cold. "I was just moving the timeline forward." He stared at her, stunned not by her boldness, but by her detachment. "So that's all I was to you? A delay?" "You were a stepping stone," she said, eyes unwavering. "A necessary chapter. That's how power works." There was nothing theatrical in her delivery. She believed it. And somehow that made it even worse. He took another step back. Claire didn't rise. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. There were no dramatics, no collapsed illusions. Just the end, sitting quietly in a silk robe, watching him like a pawn who had stepped off script. Victor felt something settle in his chest, something final. He had married a stranger who wore his last name like an accessory and viewed his death as a transaction. He said nothing more. There was nothing else to say. And Claire, knowing this, didn't offer anything either. Only silence. A silence that confirmed it all. When he turned and walked out of the room, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had seen the end in her eyes, The woman who shared his bed had been ready to bury him, and she nearly did, if not for Amira. That night, Stanton Manor was silent in the way only guilt could command. Rosa Morales stood in the service hallway, her hands twisting a dish towel she hadn't realized she was still holding. Her eyes were glassy but dry. Tears would come later, once everything settled and the consequences found their footing. Upstairs, her daughter hadn't spoken since Victor's confrontation with Claire. Amira had locked herself in the linen closet an hour earlier, whispering apologies no one could hear. Rosa didn't knock, not yet. She knew what the girl was thinking because she was thinking the same thing, that they were next, that honesty had a price in houses like this, that telling the truth against someone like Claire Davenport Stanton was the kind of thing that cost people their jobs, their homes, their futures. Rosa had served this house for 11 years. She'd known every version of Victor Stanton, distant, distracted, demanding, but never cruel. Still, loyalty never guaranteed immunity, especially not when it clashed with the kind of woman Claire was. Rosa exhaled and tightened her cardigan around her. She would go upstairs soon, face him, apologize for Amira, offer to pack. It was the only ending she could foresee. But it was Victor who came down instead. She heard his steps from the far end of the corridor, deliberate, steady. Rosa stood up straighter, smoothing her apron as if some crease in the cotton might change the inevitable. He looked different tonight, not angry, not broken, but changed in a way she couldn't name. There was no fire in his eyes, no sharp edge, just gravity. "Mr. Stanton," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. Amira didn't mean..." She was scared. She just... "Where is she?" he asked, not coldly, not warmly, just direct. Rosa hesitated. "She's hiding. Linen closet." He nodded, walked past her without another word. Rosa turned, unsure whether to follow or stay rooted, but she followed. At the closet door, Victor didn't knock. He simply said, "Amira," nothing else. Just her name, like it held weight now. Inside, the girl sniffled. "I'm sorry," came her muffled voice. "I didn't mean to ruin anything. I was just scared." He waited. That silence again, so much heavier than sound. Then the knob turned, and the door opened slowly. Amira stood there, tiny in her red hoodie, eyes swollen from crying, hands wringing the hem of her sleeves. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a child who knew too much. Victor crouched down, not a motion he made often, not in this house. Their eyes met, and she flinched. "You thought I'd be angry," he said quietly. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You thought I'd send your mother away, maybe both of you." Another nod. Her chin trembled, but she held herself still. It was a discipline no 13-year-old should have had to learn. "Why did you tell me?" he asked. "You didn't have to. You could have stayed quiet, pretended you didn't hear anything." Amira looked at her shoes. "Because I couldn't let you die." Her voice cracked, but she finished the sentence. "I heard what she said. I thought maybe you wouldn't believe me, but I had to try." Victor's throat tightened. He hadn't prepared for the honesty in that. He hadn't expected the weight of it to land so hard. "Look at me," he said. Slowly, Amira lifted her gaze. "You saved my life," he said. "That's not a small thing." Behind them, Rosa stood frozen in the hallway, tears finally breaking through. She'd expected many things from this evening, but not this. Not the billionaire boss on his knees in front of her daughter, speaking with a voice softened by something deeper than gratitude. "You saved me, Amira," Victor repeated, each word deliberate. "And that matters more than anything I own, more than this house, more than every deal I've ever made." Amira blinked hard, as if trying to process something she'd never been told before, that she mattered. Not because of who she was related to or what uniform her mother wore, but because of her own actions, her own courage. "So you're not mad?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm not mad. I'm thankful." He stood then, not abruptly, but with care. He turned to Rosa. You're not going anywhere. Neither of you. Rosa opened her mouth, but he raised a hand gently. No discussion. This house needs truth more than it needs silence. You stay. Both of you. Rosa cried then, openly, freely. She hadn't done that in years. Not like this. Victor didn't stay to be thanked. He walked back toward the stairs, and Rosa instinctively wrapped her arms around her daughter. Amira didn't cry. She just leaned into the warmth, unsure if her knees might give out. Upstairs, the house remained still, but the silence had shifted. It wasn't the same cold weight as before. It carried something else now, acknowledgement, maybe even a beginning. As Victor reached the top step and paused for just a second, he allowed himself one backward glance, not at Claire's door, but at the hallway that led to the service quarters, where two people had mattered more than his instincts, more than his wealth. He exhaled once, slowly, and kept walking. Amira, still pressed against her mother's side, heard his steps fade. And for the first time since that awful morning, the weight in her chest eased, just slightly. She was still in the same mansion, but tonight, something had changed. When Victor looked at her and said, "You saved me," it had built something fragile, but real, a bridge. And standing on it, even if she didn't fully understand it yet, Amira no longer felt so small in a house that had never seen her before. Victor had spent most of his adult life trusting systems, financial ones, legal ones, people bound by contracts and NDAs. But tonight, trust wasn't a concept, it was a fracture. He sat in his private study, the room locked behind him, the large monitor flickering with security feeds Carter had discreetly extracted from the system. No staff, no interruptions, just the truth, raw, time-stamped, and indisputable. He didn't watch passively. He watched like a man dissecting the moment he almost died. The first image hit like a hammer, the driveway, clear and cold, and a driver stepping out of the town car. Victor froze the frame. That man, he didn't know him. No familiar uniform, no ID badge, not part of the team, no protocol. No confirmation code sent. And yet, he'd been let in, granted access. The entry log was signed with Claire's digital credentials. Victor sat back, fingers tightening on the armrest. It wasn't hearsay, it wasn't paranoia, it was premeditated. This wasn't just betrayal, it was orchestration. Layers of deceit wrapped in household comfort. His mouth was dry, but he kept watching. The next feed shifted to the rear exit camera. There, idling casually on the street just past the estate's perimeter, sat a black SUV. Two men inside, not reading, not talking, just waiting, like professionals do when they've done it before. One glanced at his watch. The other adjusted something beneath his coat. Victor didn't need high resolution to know what it was. Carter had told him about the SUV, but seeing it aligned precisely with the moment he would have exited, was different. It was surgical, cold. He paused again, leaned forward, rewound 10 seconds. The second man tapped the window, a signal. They were ready. What were they waiting for? Him. Victor Stanton, billionaire investor, husband, target. Claire hadn't just wanted him dead. She had engineered a window for it. The right car, the perfect route, the men positioned. A 3-minute gap where the world wouldn't notice until it was too late. And the chilling part? If a 13-year-old girl hadn't stood in that hallway, none of this footage would matter, because he wouldn't be here to watch it. He kept the feed running as if daring it to lie, but cameras don't lie, not when the world is watching in silence. He scrubbed forward. 7:58 a.m., the main hallway, his own silhouette descending the stairs, briefcase in hand, coat draped over his arm. It was surreal to watch himself walk so calmly toward death, unaware, untouched by suspicion. He flinched when the image of Amira burst into the frame, sudden, small, but unignorable. She didn't tiptoe or hesitate. She ran, full sprint, her arms pumping, her breath sharp even on a silent feed. He paused the footage there, looked at her face. Not panic, focus, desperation, yes, but not for herself, for him. She was trying to stop something, not to save herself. She wasn't running from danger, she was running into it, for him. That alone shattered something he hadn't realized was brittle. Victor had known powerful men, advisors who'd pledged loyalty for bonuses, friends who toasted him at galas, but none of them would have done what she did. None had that kind of raw, selfless instinct. He pressed play. The next 10 seconds unfolded like a short film with infinite weight. He watched Amira reach him. Her lips moved. The words weren't audible on camera, but he remembered them now with surgical clarity. "Don't go. She wants you dead." He saw himself freeze, watched the moment his foot halted mid-step, and the exact second he looked down at her and didn't dismiss it. That was the real pivot. Not her warning, his pause. That instant when something in her eyes sliced deeper than any evidence ever could. He had trusted a contract with Claire, trusted her voice, her presence in his bed, her loyalty. But it had been a girl he barely knew, someone invisible in his own home who cracked the illusion with one breathless plea. He'd always thought loyalty was something negotiated, something earned through deals or longevity, but Amira had proven otherwise. Loyalty in its purest form is unspoken, its action taken before certainty, and hers had no agenda. He watched the video again, slower this time, and when it ended he sat in silence, not because there was nothing left to see, but because there was nothing left to deny. He leaned back in the chair, eyes still locked on the now still frame of the girl in the red dress. Frozen mid-breath, her body turned protectively toward him, as if she could have stopped a bullet with sheer will. His chest ached, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming sense that something in him had been deeply wrong. That he'd moved through his own house blind, missing the people who mattered, missing her. Claire had nearly succeeded, not because she was smart, but because he hadn't been paying attention. He'd let his world narrow to numbers and boardrooms and presentations, and the cost had almost been his life. But Amira had been watching. And when it mattered, she had acted. He reached over and saved the footage under a private name, The Moment, just that. No one else would need to see it, but he would keep it, because he needed to remember, not the crime, not Claire, but the girl who stepped between him and oblivion with no hesitation at all. And it was in the final frame, the very last second of the recording, that Victor felt his breath catch in a way he hadn't expected. Amira, standing alone in the foyer after he'd turned away, looked at the door with her fists clenched at her sides. Her shoulders rose once, a deep breath drawn like armor. She hadn't run for help. She hadn't cried. She had made a decision and acted. That image, more than anything else, undid him, because it wasn't the scene of a child reacting in panic. It was the still of someone who had chosen to be brave. Alone, he reached out and touched the edge of the monitor, absurdly, like he could thank her through glass. In a house where loyalty had been paper thin, she had been solid steel, stronger than bodyguards, truer than lawyers. He turned off the monitor. The room went dark, but inside him, something had clicked into place. She hadn't hesitated. She had seen danger coming and decided, without waiting for permission, to stop it. And in doing so, she had proven herself more loyal than any adult who had ever been paid to protect him. The following morning unfolded with a deceptive calm, the kind that only served to make the truth hit harder when it came. Victor had barely touched the black coffee on his desk when the call came through. The firm's senior estate attorney, Gerald Whitmore, didn't usually sound alarmed. In the 15 years they'd worked together, Gerald had always been a pillar of precision, dry, confident, measured. But today his voice cracked just slightly. "Victor, you need to come down to the office. Now, there's something you need to see for yourself." No cryptic language, no hedging. That was how Victor knew it was bad. 30 minutes later, he stood in a secure meeting room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore and Langston, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as two forensic document analysts projected a signed legal document onto the wall. It was dated 6 weeks earlier. Claire's name was nowhere on it, but Victor's was, a digital signature, clean, time-stamped, and authenticated by his security token. The problem was simple. He never signed it. Not with his hand, not with his device. And yet there it was. Gerald explained it in detail. Victor barely absorbed. The document was a power of attorney, ironclad and specifically crafted. In the event of Victor's death, it granted a full and immediate transfer of certain dormant financial assets to a private trust under the name Mirador Holdings, an entity Claire had created discreetly last year, using her maiden name and a Delaware address. The forgery was flawless. She had used a clone certificate key, something nearly impossible without internal help. His personal digital ID had been compromised. The thought that someone inside his circle, someone he'd once vetted and trusted, had enabled this made Victor's chest tighten. "If you had died," Gerald said, his tone grave, "Claire would have walked away with unrestricted access to over $180 million in dormant liquidity and soft holdings. Everything would have looked clean, legal, no red flags." Victor didn't answer. He couldn't. His vision blurred for a second, not from tears, but from the violence of knowing how close he'd come to erasure. Not just from life, but from legacy. Claire hadn't wanted divorce. She wanted elimination. He asked for a copy. Gerald handed him the file silently, his lips pursed in something between pity and rage. Victor sat back in the leather chair and stared at the printed page, reading the words over and over again until they blurred into symbols. She had thought of everything. Not just the plan to end his life, but how to do it cleanly. No blood, no public spectacle, just a legal chain reaction that would activate the moment he ceased to exist. No will contests, no estate freezes, no delays. The signatures matched. The paperwork was filed. The digital trail, though fraudulent, was convincing enough to pass through standard audits. She had time, Victor whispered, more to himself than anyone else. She planned it down to the detail. And worst of all, no one would have known. Not the board, not the press, not his remaining family. He would have become a cautionary tale of a man who died without the foresight to secure his own empire. He rubbed his eyes. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about betrayal on a molecular level, the kind that rewrites how you remember every kiss, every dinner, every look across the table. Gerald waited until the silence stretched too long. "Victor," he said carefully, "we'll fix this. The digital chain proves the forgery. You have enough to press charges, not just for attempted murder, but federal financial crimes." Victor nodded, but his eyes were distant. What chilled him most wasn't the document itself. It was how close Claire had gotten to making it real. One small step, one door opened, one car entered, and she would have inherited everything, scot-free. He thought of the men in the SUV. He thought of the unknown driver. He thought of Carter's confusion, but more than any of that, he thought of Amira, the girl no one was supposed to notice, the one without a key card, a title, or a seat at any table. She had seen what everyone else had missed. Not because she was smarter, but because she was watching with unfiltered eyes. She hadn't been clouded by luxury, politics, or loyalty to anyone but the truth. That simple moment, her body standing in front of the door like a stop sign in human form, had saved everything. Hours later, Victor stood again at the window of his office, the forged document still clutched in his hand. He had barely spoken since the meeting. He hadn't called Carter, hadn't updated the board. There would be time for that. Right now, all he could think about was how thin the line had been between life and disappearance. Not death, disappearance. Because that's what this was. A silent assassination, buried beneath paperwork and digital access codes. He walked slowly back to his desk, opened his personal journal drawer, and placed the document inside, not as evidence but as a reminder. He had built an empire on strategy, on being 10 steps ahead. And yet, none of that had saved him. A child had. Amira Morales. A girl with no stake in his world. A girl who should have stayed silent but didn't. As he sat back down, the door to his office cracked open. Amira peeked in. She didn't say anything, just looked at him, eyes cautious, unsure. And for the first time that day, Victor managed a faint smile. The empire hadn't been saved by lawyers or boardrooms. It had been saved by someone no one saw coming. He nodded slowly, silently acknowledging the truth. If he had gone out that door yesterday, if he had taken one more step with blind confidence, everything he had ever built would have vanished beneath Claire's forged smile and perfect paperwork. No headlines, no questions. Just another obituary for a powerful man who died too soon. But Amira hadn't let that happen. She had stood in the space between him and the lie, between him and the trap. And now, as Victor looked at her again, this girl, this quiet force, he felt something in his chest settle into place. Something heavy but certain. The document had been perfect, the crime invisible, but in the end, it hadn't been intelligence or surveillance that saved him. It had been instinct. It had been courage. And most of all, it had been a girl no one was watching. He looked back down at the document one last time, then folded it in half, because now he understood. The empire had survived because of someone no one ever expected to matter. Claire didn't fight it. That was what surprised Victor the most. After days of silence, after the confrontation that had upended everything, she walked down the front steps without a word. No suitcase, no assistant. Just a slim leather handbag, her phone tucked inside, and sunglasses too large for the clouded sky. The black sedan waited at the edge of the driveway, its tinted windows mirroring back the mansion she was leaving behind. She didn't turn around. Not once. The driver opened the rear door, and she slid in, graceful and silent, like a guest leaving a hotel she no longer respected. Victor stood on the second-floor balcony, hands gripping the rail, shoulders sagging under something heavier than anger. It wasn't grief. It was exhaustion, the kind that only came when someone you once loved revealed they were a stranger all along. When the car disappeared beyond the iron gates, Victor let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not relief, not yet. Just breath. The house was no longer a battlefield. But what was it now? He didn't linger. The silence was too loud. He stepped back inside and closed the balcony doors behind him. His footsteps echoed down the staircase as if announcing a verdict. He passed the portraits in the hall, faces of ancestors he had never met, looking down like silent jurors. At the bottom of the stairs stood Rosa and Amira. They had heard the car leave. They hadn't moved. They didn't ask what had happened. There was no need. Rosa's hands were clasped together tightly, her body tense as if waiting to be told to pack. Amira stood behind her, partially shielded, hair falling forward like a curtain she hoped would hide her from whatever came next. Victor stopped before them. He didn't speak immediately. The weight of the moment demanded more than words. It demanded clarity. It demanded something final, something true. "I know what you're expecting," he said finally, looking at Rosa. "And you're wrong." Her lips parted, the beginning of a protest already forming, but he held up a hand. "You're not being dismissed. Neither of you." He turned slightly, eyes landing on Amira, who remained still, unreadable. "You saved my life, and I'm done pretending that doesn't mean something." He paused, then added, voice low but steady, This house has had a lot of names on its title, a lot of noise, but none of that ever made it a home. Rosa blinked rapidly, the first tear threatening to fall. "Mr. Stanton," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Victor, please, just Victor." It sounded odd even to him, stripped of title, of distance, but right. He took a breath, then delivered the sentence that would change everything. "This house is more yours than it ever was hers." The sentence landed like thunder and silence at once. Rosa broke. She covered her mouth with both hands as sobs escaped. Not loud, but deeply felt, the kind of crying that doesn't just express pain, but the release of years of fear and restraint. Amira didn't cry. She didn't move. But something shifted in her eyes, a flicker, a softening, a widening of space behind her stare, like someone opening a door just enough to let light in. She didn't speak, hadn't spoken much since that morning, but her shoulders relaxed by a fraction, and her fingers unclenched at her sides. Rosa reached for her daughter's hand without looking, and Amira took it slowly. Victor noticed the movement, small as it was, and felt something in his chest settle. He hadn't expected thanks. He hadn't expected forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, he'd opened the way for something better than both: trust. He didn't make a speech. He didn't talk about fresh starts or legacies or reparations. He simply stood there with them for a moment, in the middle of the hall, three people whose lives had collided in ways none of them had planned. The air was still thick with everything unsaid, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like possibility. Victor gestured toward the sitting room but didn't lead. He gave them the choice. Rosa shook her head gently, still wiping her face. Amira took a step forward but stayed rooted in place. The moment was enough. They didn't have to move. They had already shifted. And that was when it became clear to Victor. It wasn't just Claire who had left the house. Something else had gone with her. The illusion of control, the pretended intimacy, the hollowness masked by champagne and silk curtains. What remained was real, however awkward, however raw. He looked once more at Amira, whose gaze met his, not defiant, not frightened, just open, just enough. He nodded, more to himself than anyone else. The house hadn't just changed hands, it had changed meaning. And standing before them now, in this place where silence once reigned, he saw it clearly. This house was more theirs than it had ever been hers. It had been a quiet few days, the kind that felt like standing still, even while time moved forward. There was no chaos anymore, no threats to anticipate, just a strange stillness, neither peaceful nor uncomfortable. Victor had thrown himself into meetings, legal recalibrations, and conversations with his lawyers that sounded more like post-mortems than business strategy. Claire's exit had left a vacuum that contracts couldn't quite fill. But through all the motions, he kept noticing Amira, in doorways, in corners, in the garden with her sketchbook, always scribbling and retreating when noticed. He didn't push. After all, what could he say? He was a man she'd once feared, and she was a girl who had seen more than she should have. But that afternoon, as he walked into the living room with a folder under his arm and paused to set it down, his eyes landed on the hearth. And there she was, sitting cross-legged near the fireplace, lost in whatever she was sketching. Amira didn't notice him at first. Her shoulders hunched forward, long hair obscuring her face, one hand gripping the corner of the paper as she shaded in the edge of a crest. It wasn't until he took a step closer that she realized she wasn't alone. She flinched, pulling the notebook against her chest, her face already flushed in guilt or fear. He wasn't sure which. "Amira," he said gently, not moving. "What is it?" She shook her head quickly, hugging the notebook tighter. "It's nothing. Just drawing." Her voice was soft but clear. He stepped forward anyway, and with surprising calm extended his hand. "Can I see?" For a moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, reluctantly, she placed the worn notebook in his hand. not meeting his eyes. He opened it. The page was more than a drawing. It was something personal, something careful. The Stanton family crest had been redrawn in pencil with remarkable precision, the lines shaded delicately, the shield balanced with near-perfect symmetry. But it wasn't just the crest. Below it, in deliberate cursive, she had written two names, Victor and Amira. Side by side, no hearts, no embellishment. Just the truth of what she had started to feel but never spoken. He looked at it for a long time, and when he glanced at her, she was already looking away, embarrassed beyond words. He didn't smile. He didn't make a comment. He simply closed the notebook, handed it back to her with quiet hands, and nodded once, not in amusement, not in approval, but in understanding. Then he left the room without another word. That night, after the house had gone still, Victor returned to the living room. He didn't turn on any lights. He didn't need them. He moved deliberately, almost reverently, as he removed a frame from a drawer in the sideboard. It was simple. Black wood, clear glass, nothing ornate. He slipped a new piece of parchment inside. On it was the crest again, now professionally printed, but beneath it in small gold-stamped letters were the same two names, Victor Stanton and Amira Morales. He had spent the entire evening commissioning it from his designer in the city, sending scans of Amira's sketch, even correcting the slant of one of her lines because he knew she would notice. It wasn't about ceremony. It wasn't even about acknowledgement. It was about permanence. About quietly saying, I saw you, I still see you, and you matter here. He placed the frame on the mantel precisely centered. It didn't replace anything. It wasn't a grand portrait or a new family crest. It was just a marker, small, sincere, undeniable. When he stepped back, he stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, then walked away. He didn't expect a reaction. He didn't even expect her to notice it immediately. But the act wasn't about her reaction. It was about his own choice to act on something he hadn't yet named. A growing sense of connection, fragile and real. A bridge being built, plank by quiet plank, between two people who had once been strangers under the same roof. The next morning, Amira walked downstairs as she always did, half awake, hair tangled, sleeves too long. She passed through the living room absently, almost walking past the fireplace, until she froze. Her eyes found the frame immediately. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, blinking twice to make sure it was real. It was. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there for a long, long time, one hand slowly rising to brush over the glass. She didn't have to ask where it came from. She already knew. In the quiet morning light, something loosened inside her, the kind of loosening that came not with noise, but with knowing. She had been seen. And in this house, that meant everything. The headlines were careful not to stir scandal. Victor Stanton finalizes private divorce. No names dragged, no accusations spelled out. Just whispers of a high-profile split among Manhattan's elite, buried beneath stories of corporate mergers and political squabbles. But for Victor, the ink on those pages didn't represent closure. It marked an unraveling. He walked differently now, not because of defeat, but because of what he had to confront, that his wealth couldn't shield him from betrayal, and his silence had once made him blind. He wasn't walking like a man who had everything. He walked like someone who had been burned and chosen to live anyway. The house no longer felt like a monument to image, but a place he was learning to inhabit honestly. Even his posture had shifted. Gone was the stiffness of dominance. What remained was something raw, real. Amira had begun sitting with him in the kitchen. Not every day, not for long and rarely with words, but she would come in, barefoot, hair still wet from the shower, and take the seat opposite his while he stirred his coffee. Sometimes she ate toast. Sometimes she just picked at crumbs. But she was there, and he let her be. No demands for conversation, no attempts to fill the silence. He understood now how much silence could hold: fear, guilt, hope, the aching desire to belong. Rosa noticed the change but said nothing. She only started humming again while folding linens, as if the house itself was finally exhaling. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, just small, daily choices to exist differently, to be seen and to see. And in this new rhythm, Victor found something more profound than peace. He found the possibility of forgiveness, including for himself. The biggest change wasn't the absence of Claire. It was the absence of distrust. Victor no longer second-guessed the presence of others in his home. When Amira left her sketchbook on the kitchen table, he didn't inspect it. When Rosa asked to rearrange the staff schedule, he simply said yes. These were micro-decisions, nearly invisible, but to a man who had lived armored, they were seismic. There were moments when grief snuck in. The grief of not having seen Claire for who she really was, of having let someone like Amira grow up ignored in his house. But he didn't push those thoughts away anymore. He let them come, sit beside him like uninvited guests, and then pass. For the first time in years, he wasn't holding his breath around people. And Amira, though still quiet, had stopped flinching when someone called her name. She met Rosa's gaze now. Sometimes she even met his. One afternoon, Victor cancelled his meetings early without telling anyone why. He simply walked out of his home office, set his phone on the credenza and said, "Back later." Rosa barely blinked. Amira looked up from her book, but didn't ask where he was going, and he didn't explain. 20 minutes later, they stood together at the front gate, the same one where her voice had cracked with terror, where her body had blocked his path, where death might have greeted him had she not intervened. It looked the same, but everything had changed. He didn't speak immediately. Amira stood beside him, arms folded tight over her chest, unsure if he wanted to talk or just remember. She wasn't used to him asking for company, and he wasn't used to needing it. That's why he had brought her. Because needing someone and saying nothing had nearly cost him his life. He looked down at her, not with the forced warmth of someone playing guardian, but with the weight of a man who owed her something greater than protection. The truth. "You saved me," he said, the words as steady as they were difficult. "And I don't just mean that day at the door. You saved me from the version of myself that thought silence was safer than trust, that money could replace connection, that love could be bought instead of built." Amira stared straight ahead, but he saw her throat move as she swallowed hard. He let the moment settle before continuing. "Now, I want to learn how to be alive." His voice didn't shake, but something in his chest did. Saying it out loud wasn't easy, but it felt right. He didn't expect a response. He only hoped she believed him. Amira turned her head slowly and looked at him, really looked at him. And though she didn't smile, something softened in her eyes. The kind of softness that comes when the world finally stops proving you right about how cruel it is. She didn't speak, and he didn't press. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. The same gate that had once been the edge of a tragedy now stood as the quiet witness to something reborn. Two people, once strangers in the same house, now standing side by side, no longer bound by roles, but by choice. As the wind moved past them, they stayed where they were, not walking away, not rushing toward anything, just being. And that was enough. He had said it, she had heard, and that was where it began. What starts as an ordinary day takes a dramatic turn when a young girl risks everything to warn a powerful millionaire about a plot against his life. In a split second, her desperate courage changes not only his fate, but her own. The next day, what once was just a mansion of silence begins to transform into a home. This gripping story highlights betrayal, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between a forgotten child and a man on the brink of destruction. Witness the powerful chain of events that began with a single warning and led to a life-changing connection no one could have foreseen. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you react in such a moment of courage? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe on our channel for more inspiring stories that touch the heart and remind us of the good in humanity.